Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Thank you so very much for tuning in, folks. It is great to talk to you. We are going to have a wonderful show up ahead, and if you are in Southern Ontario, which I realize on a local radio show might be easier to pinpoint, in a national podcast, an international podcast, arguably, that might not be the case. I want to apologize to you for having to deal with the snow this week. I mean, I had to as well, so I'm in it. Meanwhile, the people listening from out west are like, we've had it for, about a month and a half, but I'm still not a fan of it, so I'm still getting used to it. All the global warming we got that led us up until this point, I'm kind of grateful for. So my interview with David Suzuki, where David Suzuki said, the earth is warming, it's a fact, it's true. If that means I don't have to deal with snow until midway through January, I'm going to be perfectly candid with you. I really am not going to lose any sleep over it. But we're going to have a great show up ahead, certainly. And I'm so glad you are tuning in. I'm going to be talking later on in the program with Rondi Adamson. She is a writer, journalist, editor, teacher in Toronto. And she had a great piece in the Huffington Post, which is not something I say often, that anyone had a great piece in the Huffington Post. But it was in there, and it was great. And it was on the Canadian superiority complex. Now, not the inferiority complex. I think Canadians have a bit of that sometimes as well. But the arrogance that you see in a lot of cases, I'm going to posit the left of Canada, that we're so much better than other people, despite the fact that we're supposed to be the humble, nice, friendly, nice ones. I realize I said nice twice, but Canadians run out of adjectives. So Rondi wrote a great piece about this, tackling this, mocking this, a lighter look at a serious problem. I'm going to chat with her about it later on in the program. But I have to start off because the last few shows have really allowed me to delve into things like political correctness, microaggressions, trigger warnings, all of these areas, which, by the way, I think are very important ones. But what I haven't done yet is delved into this comment made in a blog post. It was actually a series of comments made by former British Columbia Premier Ujjal Dosanjh and former Liberal Cabinet Minister Ujjal Dosanjh about political correctness. And this is a big one. Because in a lot of cases, anytime someone speaks out about political correctness and they are speaking out in opposition to it, it's often someone like me. And people will say, what does he know? He's a man. What does he know? He's male. Because a man and a male, as we now know, don't actually mean the same thing, because you can choose one or the other. So I am a cisgendered male. I'm also white. I'm educated. I'm from a city. These are things that apparently disqualify me from having an opinion. So if I speak out against political correctness, if I speak out against the cult and culture of microaggressions and trigger warnings and being offended and all of these sorts of things, people will say, well, you can't have an opinion because you are a white cisgendered male. And Ujjal Dosanjh, which, as the name would suggest, is not a white male, he is a male but not a white one, wrote that political correctness is affecting, sadly, much of the world. And he's written about this in a way that needs to be heard, and it's important to note as well that he is not a conservative by any stretch. This is the man who, again, ran a left-wing liberal government in British Columbia. A man who represented federally the Liberal Party at the cabinet table. In retirement, though, he appears to have embraced common sense a little bit more than his bosses have during his political career. But he wrote a piece that appeared on his own blog. It was also picked up by the National Post, basically saying why, by silencing white men, Canada cannot have an honest debate about equality, race, and culture. He talks about political correctness in those words. He says, quote, "What started as a legitimate change to bring about equality and transformation of how we viewed, treated, and spoke about each other has now ossified into a rarely breached wall of silence. A silence reinforced by the onset of the West's indifference to its own, good, bad, or ugly, but distinct societies. Their values and norms, call it white man's burden or guilt, a guilt for the sins of the past, now manifesting itself in the white man's fear." Desange continues, quote, "This fear has habituated many Western leaders in their frailty to speak the unvarnished truth about the need for the refugees and the immigrants welcomed into these societies to fully integrate in them. It is not about changing one's religion or bleaching one's skin to make one paler. It is about learning the moral, ethical, social, and political anchors that, in this case, Canada is rooted in." Unquote. I'm going to return to the piece later on and give you a little bit more about it, but I wanted to first pause there because he's talking about the fact that political correctness has not just gotten in the way of person-to-person discourse. It's not just gotten in the way of me having a conversation to you, not even just me as a podcaster, as a radio host talking to you, but it's gotten in the way of how decisions are actually made. A lot of people, and I've said similar things in the past, look at political correctness as that minor inconvenience. You know, the company that says you can't say blackboard because it mentions the word black, the company that says we're not going to have brainstorming sessions because that name's offended to epileptics, we're going to instead have thought showers. By the way, that's a true story. No, instead, political correctness has a much more prevalent and much more dangerous place at the national and international tables of corporations, of governments. When President Barack Obama calls the shooting at Fort Hood at an Army base by Army psychiatrist Nadel Hassan workplace violence instead of terrorism. And moreover, when we learned that people leading up to the shooting were concerned about Nadel Hassan but didn't want to be seen as Islamophobic, we can say that political correctness is more than an inconvenience. It is a causer of casualties. Political correctness takes lives. And then I go back to Desange's piece here, and he says that fear wins out. Silence reigns in the political sphere because we don't want to fight it. We don't want to fight it. He also references a piece that I talked about on this show not long ago, which was a condo building in Richmond, British Columbia, where the meeting decided that they would conduct their business only in Mandarin, no English. Despite the fact that 30% of the residents of the condo who have a seat at the table don't actually speak Mandarin. The Richmond City Council could have intervened but didn't because, as Desange writes, the fear of being branded racist has paralyzed the Richmond politicians. And then we have Trudeau, who's gallivanting around the world, does an interview with the New York Times Magazine, and says in Canada there's no core identity. All we have are, and these are Trudeau's words, shared values, openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. Those values are what makes us the first post-national state. Canada's not a nation to Trudeau. We're post-national. It's not valuable for nations to have an identity. And it's not that I'm campaigning, by the way, to have white pride parades down Yonge Street in Toronto, down Main Street of whatever town or city you're from. It's not that I care. I'm not proud of being white. I'm who I am, and I'm happy with that. I'm fighting against the silencing, either self-imposed or externally imposed, that people feel is necessary if someone is white, if someone is a male, if, heaven forbid, someone is a heterosexual white cisgendered male, which appears to be the lowest possible score you can get in PC bingo. Even white heterosexual cisgendered females now are finding themselves not really able to have a seat at the table just because we've added so many other grievance groups to the mix here. I mean, they're only scoring a 2. So when we look at this, how do we respond to this? How do we fight this? Dosanjh says, fear, shame, silence, and non sequiturs do not build great nations. They are built by frank, fearless, and honest men and women. But yes, he's right. The fear of being branded racist is paralyzing politicians. It's paralyzing journalists. And to look at an example of this, we don't need to really look that much further than what happened in Calgary this week. A shameful, shameful event in Calgary this week. Shameful what happened, but even more shameful, the response to it. A shooting at a bar. Now, I've been to Calgary. I've done some broadcasting in Calgary. I am not a big bar person, so I've got to be perfectly frank. I've never been to the bar in question. But I can imagine that it's not enjoyable if anyone ever tries to shoot up a bar that you are at. Police are still trying to figure out what happened. Police are still investigating what exactly went down, why it happened, who was responsible for it, and so on and so forth. These are all very real investigative tools that police need to embrace. But the problem with this particular case is that there might be a possible motive that hasn't yet been shared, and certainly hasn't been shared by anyone outside of The Rebel. And Mark Stein also wrote a great piece about this as well. He writes, a brazen shooting in Calgary after a gunman opened fire inside 10 nightclub. One person was shot, bullets grazed by other unsuspecting patrons. 2 of the club's bouncers are now being called heroes. The report talks about the fact that the bouncer says he's lucky to be alive. We talk about the heroism of it. But in one report here, by reporter Tracy Nagai, Kate McMillan from SmallDeadAnimals.com pointed this out. Stein notes, you have to get to the 16th paragraph to find one key fact of the story. Muhammad Elmi, 31, and Muhammad Salad, 29, both of Calgary, each face the following charges. Ezra Levant noted in a piece on TheRebel.Media that the Calgary Herald doesn't put it until the 25th paragraph. A third guy got away, but they're assuming that his name was not Bud or Earl, Mark said. So, a Muhammad and a Muhammad and a Muhammad walk into a bar, and everyone looks the other way. We don't know if this was terrorism, but I can assure you, when 2 Muhammads walk into a bar and open fire, I think it deserves some merit. Police have said they don't know. And maybe they don't know, but certainly the media should be asking the question here. Occam's razor is the technique that you can draw the most direct line to find the conclusion, not the meandering path that goes around every which way. Occam's razor, as Mark Stein writes here, would suggest that Muhammad and Muhammad shut up that bar for the same reason that their fellow Muhammads turned a Paris rock concert into a bloodbath and the German New Year into an Old Lang rape fest. Because the infidels, rockers, boozers, and women have to be intimidated into accepting the supremacy of Islam. But the salient point is too salient to mention until somewhere between the 16th and 25th paragraphs. Muhammad and Muhammad, and Muhammad and Mohammed and Mahomet must occasionally wonder what they have to do to get a bad press. Unquote. Mark Stein nails it in every single thing he writes. This is certainly no exception. The piece, Hold the Muhammad Salad, which I think certainly makes it, especially when you learn that that's one of the man's actual names, Muhammad Salad. I'm sure it's Salad, but you know what? We're going to westernize it for the fun parts. Because here is one of the major problems of the media. No one likes to ask the tough questions. It's the same reason that David Suzuki got surprised when I asked him anything that challenged what he was going to say, because the media doesn't challenge it. It's the same reason Justin Trudeau stumbled when I asked him what ostensibly was a very simple question. The media doesn't ask them. And this isn't heralding my own interviewing skills. As a matter of fact, I'm quite baffled that people are seemingly so stumped by it. But when you have a mainstream media that isn't challenging what should be the most fundamental of details, how can Canadians feel like there is at all a road to prosperity or a road to knowledge, let alone a resolution upon us for these major problems? Things like terrorism, things like free speech. Things like any group or any individual from a group who wants to quash freedoms. Why is that something that does not seem to be a salient detail in any story? That the very freedoms that enable someone to write that news story could be threatened by an individual. Now, I've had a couple of people that have said, well, we don't know if it was terrorism. No, we don't. Do we know that any question was even asked of police? If I were a newspaper reporter and I were covering this fight, I would say to police, look, we've seen issues in the past around the country. ISIS has targeted Canada as well. We saw a terrorist attack in Canada a year and a half ago. These two men have Muslim names. Is terrorism suspected? If the police say no, then write in the piece. Terrorism is not suspected. If they say that's a possibility, say, we don't know, but it may be a possibility that terrorism is involved here. The media spares no effort in projecting motive onto other people, yet when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to Mohammed's, they seem to be a little bit comforted by taking a backseat passive role and hoping that the chips just fall where they may. No one notices, everyone forgets by the time it gets to trial. Talk about the next Pulitzer winners, everyone. And then when we look at Cologne, Germany, I mean, this is just laughable. I feel terrible for all of the women who have been raped, who have been subject to attempted rapes, who have been battered and bruised in other ways. Here I do. I feel bad that they had to endure this. Bad that there is a culture of people, not all of them, but a subset of them clearly, who believes this is the way you treat a woman or any human being for that matter. I feel bad that they have a government that endangered them by allowing this to happen. Angela Merkel herself, the Chancellor of Germany, says she has lost control of the refugee situation. Says everything that's happened in Cologne has made it impossible for her and her government to really maintain at the top of this and on top of this. Is there anyone outside of Germany who's surprised by this? That bringing in hundreds of thousands of refugees in such a quick period of time is going to come back and bite you in the rear end? Is anyone surprised by that but Merkel? But indeed, once the writing is actually on the wall, once you have, as Mark Stein calls it, the Old Lang Rape Fest taking place over the New Year holiday, it becomes painfully apparent what everyone else could have seen quite easily before then. And this is not an assertion that Muslim men exist to rape women. It is an assertion that in a culture, the culture of some of these countries, misogyny runs rampant. If you bring in enough to dilute your demographic, you're going to have a few bad apples. And when you're dealing with people's lives and people's livelihoods, you're creating a victim machine. That's what happened in Germany. And a part of me feels bad for the women, obviously. And then I look at Angela Merkel and say, you deserve to have something happen in your country. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't what anyone wanted. But she needed to see exactly what she was doing here. And again, political correctness is saying that certain people aren't covering it. How much Western media coverage has there been of what's happened in Cologne? BBC has actually, to its credit, been good on this. But most media in the West has not been. So I'm looking at this not as a new story, but as another symptom where people's lives are at stake in a broader global cancer. And that can be best summed up as political correctness. And going back to Ujjal Dosanjh's piece, there was actually a TVO column that I wanted to share something about very briefly here. It was written in response to what Dosanjh wrote, and it was on tvo.org, written by Navneet Alang. And it's concerning because it is making this apologist point for the PC doctrine adherents, saying that it seems highly debatable that the views of white men are being suppressed. She talked about something that I talked about on the show from last November when a yoga class was canceled at Ottawa University. And she said, for even the most sensitive among us, it seemed a step too far. Not because student government had become scared of offense or because certain views were suppressed, but because the actual offense in question had become lost in a haze of preemptive worry. What exactly would have been harmful about one more yoga class amongst literally tens of thousands? And this is what she writes, quote, "Perhaps the issue with political correctness is just that. Not that it is some censorious force oppressing society, but that both its proponents and opponents have lost sight of its purpose to foster a fairer, more equitable world." Unquote. Because of that, you can't do anything about it. People who genuinely believe that the world needs to be fair and equitable, instead of not manipulating results, but manipulating opportunity. Saying you have the right to seek prosperity. You have the right to seek these things. You have the right, through your freedoms, to speak freely, to vote, to work, to live your life free of the threat of rape, murder, etc., the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. When she brings up this word, a more equitable world, how do you guarantee a more equitable world? You can't. So political correctness, which once was, yes, about words, you can't say blackboard. You can't say I'm feeling like I'm going crazy. Now it's about ideas. It's about ideas. It's about victims groups. It's about saying you are higher up on the food chain. If you put a white man up against a black man on the PC leaderboard, the white person's at the bottom. You put a Jewish person over a white person, the Jewish person's up top. Oh, but you put a Jew against a Muslim, well, no, the Muslim comes up. You put a gay up against a Muslim, well, who knows in that case who gets the right of way in the political correctness game. I say we should ignore it altogether. It is a cancer on discourse. It is a cancer on discourse. And Lang is reasonably reasonable, and I know that sounds funny, but she's reasonably reasonable in her piece, except there's one line really discredits a lot of what she's saying. She says, "For my part, I tend to lean toward political correctness in the social justice activism sense of the term, because I too believe that historical bias won't simply fix itself. This means I also believe overrepresented views need to be pushed aside for a time." How do we define an overrepresented view? Just because you hear more of something than another doesn't mean it's overrepresented. It actually means that it might be exactly representative of what the majority is thinking. If the majority see that two Mohammeds open fire in a bar, well, in fact, it might be underrepresented that there is a fear of a terrorism threat. So why don't we then adjust that by overrepresenting that belief system? Or why don't we just let the chips fall where they may? Not worry about people's responses. Not only is it a heck of a lot more liberating, but it's a heck of a lot more conducive to a free society. Free not just to decide what the best way or the nicest way to word something is, but free to speak and not care if someone happens to be offended. This is the dream that people in less free countries have died trying to preserve. People die pursuing freedom of speech. And what do we do in Canada, in the United States, in the UK? We dishonor it by attaching conditions and stipulations to it. We've got to take a quick break here. When we come back in just a couple of moments, we will have more of Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
Welcome back, my friends, to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. I've spoken on this show about freedom and free speech a great deal because, frankly, I think it's one of the most important issues that any free society needs to maintain and retain and protect. Freedom in general, but within that, a hallmark is freedom of speech. So obviously censorship, and we never hear censorship called that anymore. Simply put, the face of censorship is very different than it once was. Censorship is not the state coming in with a black marker and saying you cannot read this. I mean, unless you're talking about CIA stuff. But for lack of a better term, censorship of books and thoughts and ideas doesn't happen like that anymore. It happens through institutions. It happens through political correctness. It happens in discourse. It looks a lot different than the book burnings of Nazi Germany, as an example. But on that note of Nazi Germany, what better example of an unfree society than that regime? The regime that oversaw the Holocaust, the murder and execution of 6 million Jews, whose only crime was being Jewish, was loving their God and not pledging allegiance to the Reich. This brings us to a topic that actually came up a couple of months ago on the show. Mein Kampf, the tome of Adolf Hitler, German for My Struggle, is back on the shelves in Germany. It's never been banned in Germany, although it was unavailable because the copyright of the book was owned by the government of Bavaria. When Adolf Hitler died, he willed it to the state of Bavaria, and the state of Bavaria had an agreement with the German government since 1945 where they were not going to publish the book, and they were not going to sell the copyright to anyone else, nor license it to anyone else to publish. So since 1945, when Adolf Hitler died, the book has not been in print in Germany. That changed on December 31st, when 70 years after the death of the book's author, the book became public domain. Anyone can publish it. You don't need to pay the royalties to anyone, and you don't need to get written permission from anyone. So while the book was not available in Germany, it soon overnight became available when the calendar flipped to 2016 to anyone who wanted to buy it as long as someone else was printing it. And a group of academics has been working on it for a couple of years now. It's called the Deutschland Institute for Contemporary History. And they've been wanting to, as a study of history, publish an annotated version of Mein Kampf with the history available, with the history clear, with criticism of the book, both literary and historic. And that tome they were sitting on, unable to publish until this year. And the problem now is that the book is, by all accounts, flying off the shelves. Not only is it available, but it is popular. And I do not believe in banning books. I do not believe in censorship. I do not believe Mein Kampf should be obliterated by an act of law from bookstore shelves. I think in a lot of cases people can do what Heather Reisman has done, chief book lover of Indigo chapters in Coles in Canada, and say, hey, we're not going to sell the book. But if you want to get it from somewhere else, have at it. In the age of Amazon and online retailers in general, getting your hands on pretty much anything is not exactly difficult right now. So we have two sides to this discussion. Number one, does Mein Kampf meet an extenuating enough circumstance that we can justify censorship? And number two, what do we understand about the state of anti-Semitism in the world that this book is in such demand? There was a great column in Arutz Sheva about this by Jack Engelhard. Now, he's a novelist, author of the best-selling novel Indecent Proposal, also a columnist. And he wrote that pornography always sells. And that's why Mein Kampf is experiencing the boom in sales it is. In his piece, which was published January 12th, he says, it's springtime for Hitler all over again. And the timing couldn't be worse. So far as anti-Semitism, we are back to 1933. Jack Engelhard obviously has a very personal connection to the Holocaust and to the study of the Jewish people in general and their history, and I'm very pleased to welcome him to the program. Jack, I really appreciate your time today, sir. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So let's talk first off about whether or not we could have anticipated how popular this book would be. Because I remember when I first read of this copyright issue several months ago, I thought, you know what, it was going to be one of these things that would end up having a little bit of a boom and then fizzle out. And now, as you've noted in your column here, we're seeing people literally running and rushing to stores to buy this book. So that to me is concerning.
Yeah, it is. Well, the book was never really out of print. There were all kind of pirated versions spread out throughout the world, especially through the Arab world, unfortunately. So it was always there. But, it's the kind of book you kind of read under the covers. The concern here is that by republishing it, in a sense, Germany has rehabilitated it. It's kind of now I'm sure they didn't mean it like that, but it does kind of give a stamp of approval. Now, I understand the annotated edition, that it's got criticisms in it, but the people who are going to read it for other reasons are going to get what they want out of it, and it won't make, those of us who believe in justice and decency are not going to be happy with what they find. It is a disturbing book.
Are those people, though, who do have a problematic view of the world or are anti-Semitic, are they not going to find something that reinforces that no matter where they look?
Exactly my point. You nailed it as I wrote it in my column for Arisheva. They're going to find it's going to reinforce how they feel. They're not going to read the criticisms. It's there. It is, as I said, like pornography. There are people who call pornography, it's an advice on how to, it's an advice on healthcare. Well, the people who want to see pornography will see it as such. It's going to inflame people who are already partly, I'll say, bigoted, anti-Semitic. It is going to give Germany kind of a heads up, and it's going to make people feel, well, Germany kind of is okay with this, notwithstanding the fact that Germany isn't. As I stated, I even said in my in another novel, Bathsheba Deadline, where Germany has been friendly to Israel. Just yesterday, Germany delivered, I think, the third or the fifth submarine to the Jewish state. It has been trying to make amends for the sins of the fathers. So yes, Germany has been the most helpful country, European country for sure, for the Jewish state since post-war times. So I don't believe in the highest circles of that country they meant ill, but it's going to come out that way to certain people who are coming into that country. The timing, as I say in the column, can't be worse, because we are getting an influx of people from countries where anti-Semitism is very heavy.
Not only very heavy, in a lot of cases, anti-Semitism is codified in the governments of these countries.
There you go. These people are right. Well, I'm trying to be as politically correct as possible. Okay, these people do come from countries, Syria, Iraq, where anti-Semitism is the order of the day, and it comes in mother's milk. And they arrive in Germany. They've already come, not all of them, for God's sake, but let's say it is 10%. That's the official version of how many may be indoctrinated like that. So if it is only 10%, that's still millions. Those who are coming to Germany and Sweden especially, and Finland, and that book is now going to be available in those countries, and it's not a very welcome sight to see this book on all kind of on all kind of book windows. There it is. It's like advertising. Yes, you are right the way you feel. The way you felt in your countries is how we feel in our country, and that's unfortunate.
But if someone has a pre-existing or predisposition, rather, to anti-Semitism, you said earlier on, and you said it in your piece, that they're going to look at a book, they're going to ignore the annotations and find a reinforcement of their anti-Semitism in the text of Mein Kampf. But are those people not going to still hold those beliefs anyway and still cling to internet material and cling to other people that share their beliefs? Is the book going to convert people to anti-Semitism, do you think, or only reinforce it when it already exists?
I'm afraid both. I'm afraid, first of all, it's going to reinforce. I'm not sure it's going to reintroduce. I think people who are decent to begin with are not going to be influenced by it. Mostly, I'm concerned about the culture. I'm concerned about what's in the air. I'm concerned about the feeling. There was a certain kind, as you know from your studies, that back in the 30s, it was in the air, the anti-Semitism. It was in all the newspapers, and it was a conditioning situation. You know, there's a myth that the Germans marched into one country after another under the blitzkrieg conditions. Not always. In many places, including Germany and including Austria, it took years for Hitler to condition the people. It took newspapers like Der Stürmer every day to run these hateful articles against the Jewish people, to gradually condition the people. Oh, this is not so strange. Kristallnacht in 1938-39 kind of was a first awakening that, yes, you are allowed to smash windows. The Germans up to that point were quote-unquote decent people. My God, this is the land of Beethoven.
Yeah.
So what concerns me is the culture that will predominate that part of Europe, which is already steeped in blood.
Is your opposition to the publication of this book that it's concerning, you don't like the timing of it, or is that just a matter where you wish the publishers themselves would show leadership, or do you think it should actually be outlawed? Do you think there should actually be, for lack of a better term, censorship around it?
You know, you're hitting on something as a writer. When you sit down to write a piece, you have to first think, what do I really feel about what I'm going to say?
Yeah.
When I first began the piece, I began writing that I am of two minds, because as a novelist myself, and don't forget, my novel Indecent Proposal had problems as far as censorship, as does my novel The Beersheba Deadline, because it's very tough on the Islamic world, to be very frank with you. Again, being very aware of political correctness. So I have a very strong, you can imagine as an American how I feel, how I cherish the First Amendment.
Yeah, free speech above all else, really.
Exactly. Banning books, burning books is very disturbing to me. And so I sat down and began to figure, what do I really feel? Do I really... You're familiar with the Index of Forbidden Works, which was prevalent throughout the Spanish and French Inquisitions. So we don't want to go back there again. So is there any book that deserves to be blacklisted, to be put on the index? And I rewrote the piece and said, yes, this would be that book. But don't forget, because of that book, 80 million people, the number comes stuff in my head, 80 million people were killed, plus the 6 million Jews who were singled out purposely. Something about that makes it really not kosher.
When we look at that realm of the discussion, though, you can't put the genie back in the bottle here. I mean, we have a world where even if it's not published in Germany, someone could go to any nearby country, which, let's face it, in Europe is not hard to do. People can get it on the internet. So from an enforceability perspective, isn't it more important to make sure that the history is available for people, that people do understand what this book did, rather than trying to really put out fires that are propping up all over Europe?
I think that's the ideal. The ideal is that a book like that should be allowed to be studied. I'm not in favor of whitewashing history. Andrew, don't forget, there's been a movement afoot within the United States to outlaw Mark Twain because of the N-word he used throughout Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Yes.
And that would be a terrible thing, because we have to know what people thought back in those days. You can't whitewash history. So I agree that, no, we can't do that. We have to allow people to know where we came from, what kind of people we were, and hopefully how we've improved. This book, I'm afraid, supports another point of view. It proves that we have not improved.
Yes.
And if that was the point, as I say again in the column, that if the publishers meant to be that, to be cynical enough to say, here you are, ladies and gentlemen, this book proves that the anti-Semitism that was so rife in 1933 has not changed one bit in 2016. It's still the same. That may be the high purpose of this, and it may still well be that. However, that will not be seen that way because we're talking about something much more widespread, and that is the culture. The culture of a nation. It is the culture of a nation that influences how people behave. And as I said a moment ago, when everywhere, and there already you can see, I think I saw it on the internet, stores are openly showing displays of this book. And incidentally, what rubs it in, it's a beautifully packaged book. It's a gorgeous cover.
Yeah, and that's where you have to look at the production value itself is concerningly very well thought out from the publisher's perspective.
Well, I'm one of those people. I'll walk into a bookstore, and I sometimes do buy a book by its cover. Sometimes scream, buy me, I'm so pretty. And I was a little surprised at the craftsmanship that went into producing this book. I would imagine that the cover would have been just a little bit more disturbing to advise a prospective buyer that, hey, you're buying something very secretive, something very, you're buying something untouchable.
It's dark, and you can't really rewrite that at all, no.
And the cover is very attractive. So it's part and parcel of this feeling that comes across that Germany somehow supports this.
Column by Jack Engelhard, Perfect Timing, Germany reprints Hitler's Page Turner at Rutz Shava. Really, really appreciate your time and perspective on this. Jack Engelhard, author of the book Indecent Proposal. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
You're so very welcome.
It goes into a different territory here. But what I find interesting is that so many people on the left in Canada and elsewhere in the world will look to Israel right now and say Israel is the new Nazis. No, the fact is the Jews of the 30s are the same as the Jews today, and it is the Palestinians who are the new Nazis. It is the Muslims who want the destruction of Israel and of the Jewish people, not all of them, but we see them in their midst, who are the new Nazis. The victims are the same, although certainly a lot more stoic, as they have to be getting more and more so with each passing year, with each passing day, quite frankly. Now, I have a couple of issues with the way Jack Engelhard seems to be flirting with that boundary of banning a book. I get what he's saying. I get that he's saying if you were going to make a case for doing so, it would be this book. I understand that. That's not the answer. I think what we need to do as society is unpack that anti-Semitism is very real. And it's fascinating. I spoke about Israel on my show, my podcast and my radio show, when I got back from there in November. And that was my second visit there. And my goodness, it was almost comical. The words that people used to describe me around that time. I was called by one person, actually a couple of people, but one notable example, a Jew lover. And I just laughed and said, absolutely I am. Why aren't you? Why isn't any freedom-loving person a fan of the Jewish people? A fan of their right to a Jewish state, which remains a source of persecution by the new Nazis, and also persecution by public opinion, which certainly is not as damaging, but is still something we need to be aware of in the West. So when you have this book available on the shelves of German bookstores, and you have what we're seeing, and I was talking about a few moments ago, people that have a disdain or a contempt for the Jewish people that are the ones going there and reportedly buying copies, is that sufficient grounds to ban the book? No, but it sure as heck is sufficient grounds to start questioning where we go from here, how we deal with this, how we address this moving forward. And yeah, one point that Engelhard made in his piece is that, yes, the reissue of Mein Kampf was made with critical annotations. He says, quote, meant to engage serious readers and scholars. But he said, the intellectuals may well need new edition for perspectives and historical purposes. This does not explain why the book has become a sensation. There aren't that many individuals, not enough to make it an instant bestseller. The appeal must be elsewhere, along those who will be thrilled and titillated by the twisted ravings of a madman. Unquote. And that was in perfect timing. Germany reprints Hitler's page-turner. And if you look at the discussion as a standalone one of the concept of free speech, it's easy to say the book shouldn't be banned. When you look at it in context of what we're seeing now in Europe and in other parts of the world, it doesn't change my opinion, but it certainly adds to the reason that freedom-loving individuals need to stand up for the state of Israel. That is not up for debate. When we come back in just a couple of moments, we will have more Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
How arrogant are those Canadians? I'm not sure if that's a question that people are asking around the world. In fact, the stereotype would say we're the nice ones. You know, we've all heard this myth that Americans put a Canadian flag on their backpack so that they get treated more nicely when they're abroad. And that may speak to European bigotries more than it speaks to any realities. But it's kind of interesting because I like Canada. I'm proud to be Canada. I love my country. I'm a patriot. I also like the United States, although I recognize it's become a bit of a gong show there. But I get fed up of the superiority that Canadians tend to have about Canada, especially when it seems to be directed at the wrong reasons. If I was to be proud of my country publicly, which I am, I would make my pride about things like having freedom, make my pride about things like having a capitalist country. I would make my pride about things that I think are universal in a way, but that Canada does well. But when we hear Canadians talking about how great we are, it's only done as a comparison to other countries. We're better than the U.S. at this. We have better healthcare. We have better this. We have better this. And it always comes back to hockey, by the way, which I'm really unconcerned with, to be perfectly candid with you. And it always seems to revolve around healthcare. Canadians who are proud of their country typically do so out of a love of big government, which is one of what I think is the biggest failings of Canada. So pride is pride. And if you are proud to be Canadian, I suppose that's something that we should be supportive of. But at the same time, I wonder if maybe we need to get over ourselves. Now, that was the proposal put forward in a Huffington Post column this week by Rondi Adamson, a writer, editor, and teacher from Toronto. And she says that's her solemn goal for this country in 2016, that it will be the year that Canadians get over ourselves. She talks about the Canadian propensity for self-aggrandizement. It's informed these days, she said, from the massive coverage of the arrival of Syrian refugees. And she continues, but it seems nothing can dull our love of comparing ourselves to the United States and making a big deal of it when we get attention from our neighbors. Now, I like attention from everyone, but the point is well taken. And who she's talking about here is a man from Calgary named Bob, who apparently was ranked at one of the top online commenters on the New York Times website, which is a shame because I thought I was one of the top online commenters on the New York Times website, whose 5-year-old post went viral talking about, again, how wonderful Canada is in relation to the United States. To unpack this a little bit more, Rondi Adamson joins me on the line, writer, editor, and teacher. So great to have you on the show, Rondi. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, not at all. I'm happy to be here.
So you've talked about a number of examples here, but talk to me first off about the inspiration for this, because you've summed up a lot of different ideas that have been really half-formed in my head before, and I think you really put them very well.
Well, thank you. Well, for me, it started at the end of last year when we accepted the first plane loads of refugees, and I'm in favor of us accepting refugees, but I found the coverage and the self-congratulations really kind of terrible. I thought this sort of goes against how we should be treating them. And they're getting off a plane, starting their new life. They're accosted by cameras and politicians and made to try on winter coats in front of everyone. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is just the wrong way to handle it. And we were acting as though we were the only country accepting refugees, which is patently not true. And I link in the article to a very good National Post piece showing just exactly how untrue that is, how so many European countries have taken far more refugees, certainly, than we have. So it started with that, and then this Bob from Calgary comment in the New York Times that just made it sound like we live in this paradise with no crime and no problems and futuristic, perfectly run cities, and in turn, it was completely in comparison to the States as well, which sort of bothered me. It's one thing to sort of say, well, we have great things in this country, which we do. This is a terrific country. But to make it entirely about pitting us against the United States and saying, well, we everything we've got is better than what they have. And he made it sound as though the United States was just this great big, decrepit, crime-ridden, terrible place. And that's patently not true. So it bothered me, and I sort of put the two ideas together.
Well, and one of the things you note here is that Bob's annual household income is, as you've said, and as he said, $250,000. Yes. He's from Calgary, which is a nice city. It's an affluent city. The province is in a pretty good situation. He's well educated. You could find someone on the Upper East Side in New York City and compare them to someone in the Scarborough Bluffs, and all of a sudden, the U.S. looks a lot better than Canada. So I find it to be really one-dimensional that people, and Canadians and Americans do this, by the way, that people think there's one Canadian experience and there's one American experience.
Well, exactly. He starts off, and good for him for admitting it, saying my annual household income is $250,000. Well, that's a heck of a lot more than my annual household income, and more than the annual household income of many Canadians. And his comments are they're just very black and white. And now, admittedly, it's a comment on a newspaper column. You don't have all the space in the world. But he could have focused, say, on one or 2 points and been a little bit more realistic than just trying to go through all of these factors that he feels make us so much a better country. And I don't know if it's our superiority complex or if we've just got a massive inferiority complex, which is why we respond to these sorts of things.
Well, and I think there's also a question here of why can't we just run our own race? I mean, why can't Canadians say, you know what, we're happy with what we're doing. We're happy with how our government looks after us. That's assuming that everyone was. We're happy with this service and this healthcare and this education. I don't know why the comparison is such a necessity for people, because I see this all the time in talk radio and in people writing in if I write a column. I mean, it's this, well, it's better than in the U.S. And like, why do you care? I mean, if you're happy with it, who cares what everyone else is doing?
Well, precisely, and that's what I mean. I think it really must be an inferiority complex or something about living next to this great power, but we do really need to get over that because, as I point out in the piece, one of the reasons we have so many of the good things we have is through the circumstances of history and geography. We are next to the United States, and that helps us in many, many ways, economically, militarily. We're really quite lucky in that regard, and they are too. They have a nice, peaceful neighbor next to them.
So herein lies the really interesting question of whether or not, if the roles were reversed and we were seeing Americans, so excited about themselves and so excited if, there was an American who commented on a Globe and Mail article and it was like the most viewed comment, what would Canadians say about that American response to that? I can't imagine it would be favorable.
Oh, we'd be furious. And, we always put them down for their, of course, I'm speaking generally, but we always put them down for their patriotism and how they talk themselves up, supposedly, although I find that's an overgeneralization. When, as you say, why can't we just run our own race and say, okay, fine, good for them, but we're happy with what we have here, or we're happy with this part of what we have here, and so forth. But it always seems to be about comparing ourselves to them. And it's embarrassing, and it feels like, as you say, the kid at the table who wants to get noticed by adults. And we don't need to be that way.
How has the response been to this piece? Because I know Huffington Post, I've written there a few times, you don't generally have an audience that's sympathetic to the United States. So any story, and by the way, it's not like you're an American apologist in this story, but certainly I think people will boil your argument down to that. So I have to ask how the response has been.
Well, so far it's been people either saying, I was quite surprisingly and nicely had a couple of people email me and say, thank you for this sort of takedown of that comment from Bob from Calgary. But I've had quite a few more saying, well, you're so negative. Or the typical thing whenever you're slightly critical of Canada in public, in media, is, oh, you hate Canada. Well, anyone who thinks that didn't read the article, because I make it quite clear that actually I agree with Bob about a number of things. I just think he's not looking at context, and he's not looking at things in detail, obviously.
So one of the things that we always see brought up whenever we're comparing ourselves to others is healthcare. And it's funny. I mean, when I've talked to American healthcare experts, they've said, to say there's any dichotomy with healthcare one way or another is wrong. There are more options than just two. And if there were two, Canada and U.S. wouldn't be the ones you'd go to.
No.
But the other side of it is that it comes down to this whole Canadians are nicer. I mean, that seems to be really the common denominator of all of this. Canadians are nicer, and that's why everyone has quote-unquote free health care. Canadians are nicer, that's why we have refugees. Canadians are nicer, that's why we have gay marriage. And I think it's such a simple way of really trying to summarize pretty complex discussions that have happened in this country.
Well, exactly. And it also, I don't know that it's true. I think in both countries there are very nice people. And I also don't know that is how you get these policies, by niceness. To some degree, you get them through economic good fortune. We've been very fortunate. We'll see what happens now that our dollar's tanking and the price of oil has tanked. It's easy to be nice when you can afford it. So we'll find out what happens. But yes, it's just I think a terrible way to approach things as well.
Well, yeah, and as far as that niceness goes, when I was talking a couple of moments ago about, needing to compare someone's economic situation in a more realistic way than finding some well-to-do man in Calgary.
Yes.
But the other side of it is with niceness. I mean, if you go to the southern U.S., I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've been to Tennessee, I've been to North Carolina. Oh my goodness, you're going to get better service and more niceness there than, no offense to people from Toronto, you ever would in Yorkville.
Oh, precisely. Oh, absolutely. I know what they mean by Southern hospitality. You're quite right. And even in New York City, I mean, people are friendly. They talk to you. They engage. They're very engaged and warm. So, how do you define niceness? I simply think that's just a part of our, I guess, inferiority/superiority complex. And it's not necessary. It's embarrassing behavior.
So what do you think it would look like if Canadians could really start going down that road to, as you caution us, to get over ourselves? What are the first few steps we should embrace here?
Well, I think we should be realistic about things, about judging other countries' health care, for example, making simplistic comments about a country that has a population 10 times ours, which does make a big difference in terms of how you live your daily life and in terms of policy. My mother was from Norway, which is a country with a very small, pretty homogeneous population. And Canadians always praise Scandinavia. I think, well, it's pretty easy when you've got a small, homogeneous population in a very wealthy country. So I think we need to look at things with more context, be grateful for what we have, of course, and really stop being so obsessed with the U.S. It's childish. It's adolescent. It's, as you say, kid at the table. Also reminds me a bit of sort of the nerds in school who want the cool kid to notice them. That's always how I feel we are. We want the football star to notice us, but we also look down on him because we figure we're smarter. So, get over that. Recognize we are lucky. And, I think we're good people. We're a good, generous country. But I don't think we're, quote unquote, better than the United States. I think we have some advantages over them, and they have some over us. We're both free countries. I think that's the key.
Yeah, and to your point as well, I remember I was talking, it would have been maybe about a year ago, about military spending in Canada, and someone said, oh, well, why can't we be more like Switzerland to look at their military? I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't really just pick random countries around the world and say, well, we could do that like them and that like them. No, we have a size which is second only to Russia in the world. We have a sparse population. We have different groups, different communities. We have to find a way that works for us. I think we're doing that. But I also think that in the age of BuzzFeed, where everything needs to be a list, we're so obsessed in general, I think it's human nature, with comparisons.
Yes, absolutely. No, and that just is but I'm a middle-aged woman, and that has been true of us for as long as I can remember. And I think it's one of the reasons I get so frustrated with it. I think we really need to grow up as a nation. We're lucky. We live next to another free, wonderful country. Just be grateful for that. So I'd like us to get over that, but I don't know if we ever will. I really don't.
Well, you've laid the groundwork for it, so let's hope for the best, and maybe you can be the Canadian Bob of 2016 to go viral for telling it like it is. Rondi Adamson joining me on the line, writer and editor and teacher in Toronto. Also, you can check out one of the projects she's involved in at My Uncle's Letters from the War on Tumblr. Rondi, thanks so much for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
We can only hope, right? We can only cross our fingers and hope for the best. I think that if anything, this is going to trigger more of that Canadian superiority. And how dare she criticize this wonderful country? We are better than the U.S. and cue liberal outrage any moment now. When we come back in just a few moments' time, we are going to have a wrap-up here of Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. My name's Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned, Canada. We'll be back in just a moment.
Listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Okay, this is one of these stories that falls into that category of not from the onion, not satire. It is a real, honest-to-goodness true story from all that I've been able to figure it out. And this is a sign of the times when we look at the age of trigger warnings and microaggressions and all that stuff we were talking about earlier. An emotional support turkey. This is a real thing. Someone posted a picture online, which has now gone viral, of a friend of theirs on a plane, and behind the friend is a man who is traveling with his therapy pet, which is an honest-to-goodness turkey who stands tall enough to have his head look over the seat. Now, this turkey is there for emotional support. It doesn't look happy. It probably wasn't very quiet. Airlines cannot discriminate against you because they say they will take therapy pets as long as you have a doctor's note and give them a heads up. So you could be traveling with pretty much every conceivable animal. And this actually was a funny story of it. And I'm sure the turkey was well behaved. Maybe he just put a therapy pet sticker on the turkey and had it for dinner that night. I don't know. But it reminded me of a story out of Dearborn, Michigan from several years ago, where a Muslim woman who couldn't have a dog because, of course, dogs are unclean, won the right in a fight with the city of Dearborn to have a seeing eye horse travel with her on the city bus. I kid you not, she won the right to have a seeing eye, maybe it was a pony, but a pony is a horse, right? And this was really at the height of this, or right before it all started. It was back in 2009. Now we'd look at this and say, well, how dare anyone challenge her? But she was excited. Her horse was a 3-year-old miniature horse, but it's still a friggin' horse. I mean, it's bigger than a dog for starters. And she wanted more independence. The guide dog wasn't an option. So she got the horse. It's a former show horse. And she said, quote, I want a horse that will be a partner for the next 30 or so years. So she's about 24 years or 23 years into her relationship with this horse now. But to be honest, I'd rather be traveling on a plane with a turkey than a horse, I think. Then again, who am I to judge? When we come back next week, we will have more of Canada's most irreverent podcast. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. My name's Andrew Lawton. Thanks for tuning in, Canada. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.